All right, so continuing on from where we left off with this initial application that we were creating, looking at my first GUI application, we saw that we set up a scene that has a single root node, this HBox, which then consists of three controls or three leaf nodes if we're going by the scene graph, which consist of a label, a text field, and a button to essentially create just one entry or one single element that would comprise a form of some kind. So if we take a look at this again, when I initially compile this, and then run it, we see that right now the way that we have it set up is that it kind of constrains or confines all of the content to a window that's just large enough to display all of it. We ideally want to try to adjust this so that by default, when we initially start the application, the length and height of this window are maybe adjusted to give this a bit more space. We probably would also like to go ahead and move these elements so that they're not just kind of pushed into this top left corner. Perhaps centering them in the middle of the application would be a little bit better. We also want to try to provide a bit more space between the elements to make them stand out or to kind of distinguish them from one another. So we want to start looking at ways that we can go about actually customizing our application so that it's more presentable and also a bit better on the eye for any of the end users that will be using our system. Okay, so I'll go ahead and close that and come over here and make some adjustments to this. So the first thing I want to do is add some additional parameters to specify a length and a height for my application window. And in order to do that, I'm going to modify the scene for this application. So in addition to this initial parameter that I've given it, this HBox, which specifies the root node of this particular scene or for this particular application, I want to go ahead and add a second and a third parameter. So the second parameter is going to be the number of pixels to specify the length or width of the application. And then the third parameter is going to be the number of pixels to specify the height of the application. More precisely, it's going to be the application window. So in this case now I'm going to make this 400 by 250. So I'll go ahead and save that. And we'll come over here and we will compile it and run it. And so now we can actually see this being 400 for the length and 250 for the height. So it actually provides a great deal more space so we can actually start repositioning these elements in a way that is a bit more presentable to the end user. Okay, so in addition to this, I also want to go ahead and try to reposition this. So I want to make sure that the elements are actually located more in the center of the application window. I think that that would be a better approach to this. But in order to do that, I'm going to need to introduce another class to my program. So this is going to be one that comes from another package within our JavaFX library. So we're going to do javafx.geometry. So we have this geometry package that allows us to access a couple of different classes. In particular, there will be two from here that we want to use that are related to things like padding and, in this case, alignment or positioning. So the class that I want to use here is going to be this pause class, which is short for position. Okay, so then once I actually have that, I can come over here, and after I've created this HBox, what I want to go ahead and do is just take that HBox and position that at the center of my application window. So in addition to the position that I'm going to show you, there are a few others that we can also consider. So just to give you a general idea, we can imagine that there are things like, say, if I want to keep it in the upper left-hand corner, we have a position to the effect of top left. If I want to, say, maybe move this to the exact opposite position, so maybe to the bottom right. And then in addition to these, we also have some in the center. So we could have something like just right in the very middle of our applications. We could use something like center. In addition to these, we also have a few others. So there's going to be things like, in addition to top left, we also have a top center. We also have a top right. We'll go ahead and move this center right here. In addition to this, we have center left, and then center right. And then we also have our bottom right, as well as our bottom left, and our bottom center. So these are a couple of different positions that we can specify within our application window, and the one that I'm concerned with is going to be center. So in order to use this, what I'm going to do is do my hbox.set alignment. So I'm going to use this method called set alignment that allows me to reposition this hbox in whatever location I need within my application window. And then the thing that I pass into my set alignment is going to be some constant from that position class. So I'm going to do pause.center. Okay. And then once I've done this, I can come back over to my terminal. We'll go ahead and compile this and run it. And now we can see the content being displayed right in the center of the application window. Okay. And then the last thing I want to go ahead and do is modify the amount of spacing that I have in this between the elements within this hbox. So in order to do that, this is very similar to what I had to do to my scene, where I introduced some additional parameters to the constructor to specify a length and a height. If I want to specify some padding or some spacing within the layout, the container that I'm going to use, I just need to introduce another parameter that comes at the very beginning of the constructor for that layout, for that container. So in this case, what I want to do is just a little bit of spacing between the elements. So the first parameter I'm going to put here is going to be for the number 10. So this 10 right here is going to specify 10 pixels of spacing in between the label and the text field, as well as in between the text field and the button. So I'll go ahead and save that. Come over here and compile and run this one more time. And now we can actually see that there's a little bit of spacing between the elements of this. Okay, and everything will still function just as normal, so I can still put in my name for the text field. Currently the button will still do nothing. We'll come back to that a little bit later so we can actually start introducing some functionality to this. But before we get into that, the next two things I want to cover. So within this video, I still want to go ahead and discuss two other containers that we can use. And then in the next video, I also want to discuss a little bit about images. And then after that, I'll address the functionality for this button. Okay. So at this point now, I'm pretty satisfied with the way that this is looking. Obviously, there's some additional points to style if we want to include that. But as far as just a first draft for the overall structure or positioning of the elements for this application, I would say that this is a pretty good place to stop at. Okay. All right. So at this point now, we've seen what this looks like through an hbox. So the next thing I want to go ahead and take a look at another container is going to be the VBox. In addition to looking at the VBox, I also want to go ahead and take a slightly different approach with the positioning for this. So we've seen what it looks like when we do a set alignment and we use this pause class. And so for this next one, go ahead and make a new file for this. If you're doing this through an IDE of some sort, you'll go ahead and make a new project so that you can go ahead and create a new JavaFX application. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Keep this in Java projects. For this particular one, the primary purpose is to demonstrate the VBox class. So I'm just going to do vbox.demo. Another thing I want to go ahead and do, since I'm going to be using a lot of the same classes for this one, I'm just going to go ahead and grab a couple of these now. So I know that I still want to be using my application, since every time I create a JavaFX application, I'm going to always need this. Same with the stage and the scene. You're always going to have to use these. There will be no exceptions to that. Instead of using an hbox, I want to instead use a VBox. And for this particular one, I primarily just want to do this with 3 labels. We'll keep this one fairly simple. Okay. So the next thing I need to go ahead and do is make my class header. So we'll do a VBox demo. And just like with the My First GUI application, we need to go ahead and make sure that this extends the application class. And again, the reason that we need to make sure this extends the application class, to make sure that we fully understand this, This is so that we have access to that launch and that start method within our class. So then we'll go ahead and do our main method. So we'll do public static void main. We'll provide our parameter for our main method, and then we'll give it the launch method. We'll just say launch and pass in the args if we were going to use any. And then the next thing we want to go ahead and do is set up our start method. So we do public void start. We'll have our stage that we can call primary stage. And then we can go ahead and start working on adding some content to this so that we can actually create the scene for this. Okay, so the first thing I want to go ahead and do is just make some labels. So I'll just do 3 labels for this one. So say that this is going to be a demo for the VBox container or the VBox layout. Say that this is that this will arrange our controls in a vertical position. And then for our third label, let's say that we're going to position this container using padding. So rather than trying to do this with the pause class and with the set alignment method, I intend to do this instead with a different class and with a different method. So to start adding this in, rather than using the pause class, which will deal with positioning, what I want to use instead is going to be another class that comes from that geometry package. So this is going to be the second class that I mentioned previously. The actual class that we're going to be using is what is known as insets. Okay. And these insets are going to be used to actually specify some amount of padding that kind of surrounds the control or container that you've specified it for. So you can kind of think of padding like spacing, except that instead of affecting the internal setup or the internal structure of a particular container, it's actually going to affect the outside or the external structure of that container. Okay. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and make a VBox, and I'll just use the same approach that I had for the HBox. For the name, I'll just call it a VBox in all lowercase. I'll say this is a new VBox. And for this one, I want to go ahead and just give this the same parameters for its constructor, or at least very similar to what I did for my first GUI. So we'll just specify 10 pixels of spacing, and then we want to do label 1, label 2, and label 3. Okay. Okay. And then after we do that, the next thing I want to go ahead and do is actually try to give this some padding. So in a very similar case where we saw that we used that set alignment method to specify the positioning or the alignment of our HBox, as you can probably imagine, we're going to use a very similarly named method. This is going to be for set padding. And then the thing that I need to pass into this is going to be an object of that insets class. So I'm just going to make a new insets right here. And then the thing that I need to pass into this is just going to be some number that we can use to determine the amount of padding that we're going to specify. So for right now, what I'm going to do is just specify 10 pixels of padding. This is going to affect every side of our VBox. So to kind of think about that, you can imagine the VBox itself as just as the name would imply, just think of it as a box, and it has a top, a bottom, a left, and a right. And what I'm going to do is essentially specify 10 pixels of padding on each one of those 4 sides of that container. So by just giving this one number, just a 10 like this is going to affect all 4 sides of it, and they're all going to have the same amount, which is that 10 pixels of padding. Okay. And then once I've done that, then I can go ahead and make my scene. This is going to be equal to a new scene. In this particular case, what I want to try to do is use the opposite for the dimensions on this one. So we'll still go ahead and make sure that the first parameter is our root node, which is going to be that VBox. And then for the length and the height, I want to go ahead and just invert the two parameters that I used for my HBox. So we're going to do something, let's see, we used 400 for the width and 250 for the height. So for this one, we want to do 250 for the width and 400 for the height. Okay. And then the last thing I want to do is just go ahead and set up my stage. So we'll do something like primary stage.set scene. We'll give it that scene object that we just created. We'll go ahead and set the title to VBox demo. And then finally, we'll make sure that we actually display this. All right. Okay. So now that we've got everything set up, we'll go ahead and compile this and run it. So we'll go ahead and clear that. Okay. Okay. So at this point now, this is kind of just a test to see what these dimensions would look like. Looks like I'll probably need to specify a slightly larger length for this. And it also looks like the height doesn't need to be quite as long as it is. But the first thing that I want to go ahead and note is the specification for padding that I did. So as you can see right now, if you look along the left-hand side and the top side for that VBox, you'll notice that it's no longer pressed against the very edge of the application window. Instead, now it's been kind of pushed out a little bit. And so this pushed out portion of it right here, this is where the padding has been applied. So this is 10 pixels of padding along the left and the top. And even though you can't really see it because of the way this is set up, there is actually this application of 10 pixels of padding along the bottom and along the right as well. Okay, let's go ahead and see if we can adjust the dimensions on this for something that's a little bit better. So maybe we'll bump this to about 300, and we can probably bump this down to just like 150. Go ahead and take a quick look at that. And that looks a fair bit better. Okay. All right. And then one last thing I want to go ahead and do, just to clarify, since you might be wondering why it is that we needed to specify an object for our padding. Why not just put the number 10, kind of like what we do for things like spacing or for the height and the width for our scene, for our application window. Why do we need to go through the trouble of creating an entire object just to specify the single number for padding? That seems a bit over the top. Well, the main reason that we need to do this is because of the fact that there are actually a few different ways that we could apply this padding. So this insets is actually meant to hold not just a single number like this. We could also specify more parameters for this and actually customize the padding a little bit further. So instead of putting just one single number like this, another approach we could take is to actually put 4 different numbers for this. So just to kind of start off with, we'd have something kind of like this. So the order this is going to go in is that it starts from the very top of our container that we want to apply this padding to, and then it goes in a clockwise motion around the container, or the control if you do it that way. So in this case, this first 0 is for the amount of padding that's being applied to the top. This second 0 is the amount of padding that's being applied to the right. This third 0 is the amount of padding being applied to the bottom. And this last 0 is the amount of padding that's being applied to the left. Okay, so if I were to specify just one of these, say I only modify this one to be 10, then at this point now, the two that we were most concerned with were the top and the left. So the top is at 0 and the left is at 10. So now when I go ahead and compile and run this, we'll actually see that the content is pushed away from the left edge, but is now up against the top edge of our application window. So if we compile this and run it, we can actually see now that we've moved away from the left edge, but it's right up against the top edge, essentially where the title and these couple of controls for the application window happen to be. Okay. So this gives you a general idea about things like alignment, padding, spacing, and also setting up the length and the width for our application window. Okay. So now to wrap this up, one last thing that I want to demonstrate is going to be the last of these first couple of containers that I want to look at, which is going to be the grid pane. So we'll go ahead and make another new file or a new project. I'm going to go ahead and save this one. And for this one, I'm going to make it a grid pane demo. Okay. So for this one, once again, I'm going to go ahead and just grab a couple of things that I'm going to need over here. So let's go ahead and just grab these 4 things. Go ahead and put those right there. The one thing that's going to change is that instead of using the VBox, we're going to use a grid pane layout. And then go ahead and through the motions of reconstructing the class for this program. So this will be a public class grid pane demo. This will again extend our application class. We can then go ahead and give this a main method. Give it our arguments as our parameters. We'll put in that call to the launch method. We'll then go ahead and make our start method. So we'll do public void start, stage, primary stage. Okay. So now that we've got our initial setup, now we want to go ahead and actually start introducing some content for this grid pane demo. So for this one, what we're going to be doing is actually using the grid pane layout. As I go through this, you'll see that this is a little bit different from the way that the VBox and the HBox are handled. As far as the initial construction of the grid pane and adding some controls or some content to that grid pane, you'll notice that the implementation for this is going to take a slightly different approach. Okay. So to get started on this one, let's see. So first what we want to do is create a couple of labels. So for this one, I want to go ahead and test this with, let's say 4 labels to go through this. So our first label, this is going to be a demo of the grid pane layout. Make another label. I want to go ahead and specify exactly how the grid pane layout works. So this is going to arrange items in rows and columns. I have our third label for this one. Say something like, be careful about adding content to a grid pane. And as soon as I start going through the steps for that, you'll start to understand precisely why I'm including this warning. And then for this last one, let's add an additional point about what I'm specifying with label 3. Basically what I want to try to warn you about is paying attention to which of the 2 parameters you're going to be specifying when we talk about this rows and columns, this pairing that we have. We want to make sure that we don't accidentally get that mixed up. Okay, so the next thing I want to go ahead and do is actually make my grid pane. So this will take the same practice I'd used for the HBox and the VBox. I'll just go ahead and give it the name grid pane, but in all lowercase. Go ahead and make a new grid pane object. And as far as the actual construction of our grid pane goes, this is pretty much going to be it. So we don't actually specify the content that we want to put into this when we initially construct it. Instead, what we need to do is construct it first and then add the content afterwards. So this is one of the key distinctions between the grid pane and the VBox and the HBox. So this is also where this issue of being careful about how we specify the ordering of our content, where that warning comes into play. So what I want to do now is grab my grid pane, and then I want to use the add method. And this allows me to actually start adding controls or other layouts to this grid pane. So in this case, I want to go ahead and add my first label to the very first position in this grid pane. So the grid pane is arranged in this ordering of rows and columns, grid, if you will. So the very first position, if you started from the upper left-hand corner and worked your way down to the bottom right-hand corner, the very first upper left-hand corner, that's going to be at position 0, 0. So in a similar way to our arrays, where we saw that our arrays are indexed from 0, the grid pane itself is also going to use its positioning starting from 0. So that's going to be the upper left-hand corner at 0, 0. For the next part, I want to go ahead and add the second label. So this is going to be right across from the first label. So the second parameter, this will be for label 2. The second parameter is going to be specifying the column, and the third parameter is going to be specifying the row. So if I do this, this is going to put this at column 1 and row 0. And just to demonstrate real quick what this looks like with just these two, let's go ahead and finish out the rest of this. So we want to go ahead and make our scene. This will be equal to a new scene. We'll be using the grid pane as our root node for this one. As far as the dimensions go on this one, just to guarantee this is going to be wide enough to display all of this content, I'll start this off at something like 600 for my length, and for the height we'll just do something a little bit smaller, say like 300 for right now. And then I want to go ahead and set up my stage. So we'll go ahead and set the scene, put in that scene object. We'll set the title to be a grid pane demo, and we'll go ahead and show this. Okay. So now that we've got all that set up, we'll go ahead and run this and just see what this looks like with just that first row filled out. So we'll go ahead and clear this. I'm going to go ahead and compile my grid pane demo. And it looks like I might have accidentally left off quotations for my title. There we go. Whoops. Okay. All right, so at this point now we can actually see this. So we can see that we've got, the very first label in this upper left-hand corner. This is a demo of the grid pane layout. We don't have any spacing just yet. We'll go ahead and add that in a moment. But we can go ahead and see the next label just across from it. The grid pane layout arranges items in rows and columns. Looks like we need to go ahead and fix that as well. So we'll close that. Go ahead and correct my grammar right there. And then the next thing I want to go ahead and do is we'll go ahead and add in the other two labels to this grid pane, and then we'll also go ahead and introduce a little bit of spacing and I think a little bit of padding as well. So we'll do grid pane.add. This will be label 3. So for this one, I want to go ahead and put this one underneath the first label. So this will basically be on the next row down, but at the very start of that row. So this will be at column 0 and row 1. And then we'll do grid pane.add and label 4. And this is going to be at column 1, row 1. Okay. So that'll set up all that. We'll then go ahead and specify our spacing for this. So in order to specify some spacing for a grid pane, as I mentioned before, when you construct a grid pane, you don't put anything into the constructor. So that also includes, say if we look at one of these, how we have this specification for spacing at the beginning. So we're not going to include that in the constructor itself. Instead, what I need to do is just go ahead and specify that within the, or through a set of methods for it. So to do this, I'm going to do grid pane and then do a set. And so the two set methods that I want to use, one of these is going to specify the spacing if we do this horizontally, and another one's going to specify the spacing vertically. So we're going to do the set h gap, do that as 10, and then grid pane dot set v gap, and that'll also be 10. Okay. So this will actually specify the spacing overall to be 10 pixels, whether that's horizontally or vertically. Okay. And then the last thing I want to go ahead and do is also include some padding for this. I'm going to go ahead and grab the insets class for my padding. So we'll get that from that geometry package again. And then we'll just go ahead and put that right here, I think. And as far as padding goes, that'll be exactly the same as it is for the VBox and the HBox. This is at least the one thing that the grid pane has in common with those two. So this will be a new insets. We'll just do 10 pixels all around, so I'll just use a single 10 to be able to cover that part of it. Okay, so at this point we'll go ahead and try this. Oops. So go ahead and compile that, and then run it. Ideally the one that does not have the extension. Okay, so at this point now it's getting a little bit too short to fit, so I might have to adjust the length a little bit more. But for the most part, what we can see now is that at least all of the individual elements are separated enough so that we can actually see each one of them or distinguish each one of them from another. We've also included a little bit of padding to move this away from the upper left-hand corner of our application window so that we can kind of actually see each one of the four labels. So, you know, we've got our, this is a demo of the grid pane layout. The grid pane layout arranges items in rows and columns. We have to be careful about adding content to our grid pane, but making sure that we pay attention to which parameter is which. So making sure that we don't mix up the rows and columns for our individual elements of our grid pane. So one last thing to go ahead and finish up on. We'll close this. And I want to make one minor modification to this. So rather than 600, let's go with something like 650. And as far as the height for this goes, I'm going to set this to 150 as well. So try dimensions kind of like this, just to be absolutely sure that everything is fitting properly. I'll go ahead and compile that and run that. And that looks a fair bit better now. Okay. Alright, so at this point now, this will wrap up everything that I wanted to talk about as far as containers and customization goes. In the next video, we're going to take a look at actually adding images to our applications, and then in the part of the video that follows that, we'll also take a look at setting up buttons so that we can actually start getting these to adding some functionality to these buttons. For example, trying to set up some functionality for this submit button within this form that we looked at in our very first application that we wrote.